Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. My name is Chris and here I share my journey with cross stitching. In my previous Flosstube video, I talked about my floss organization method and I'd like to thank you all for your lovely comments and questions. It makes me so happy that we can share ideas, learn from each other, and spread knowledge and positivity. In today's video, I'll be sharing my stitching methods. It's going to be a longer one, so I've divided it into chapters to make it easier to navigate. Of course, I'd love for you to watch the whole video, but you can also jump straight to the sections that interest you the most. You'll find timestamps for each section in the video description below, as well as in my pinned comment. I would also like to take a moment to mention a few YouTube channels that I truly appreciate. These are creators who share their stitching experience and knowledge, and I've learned so much from them over time. Of course, this isn't a complete list, there are so many wonderful creators out there, but I've chosen the ones who have had a big influence on me. The channels are listed in alphabetical order simply because I don't want to prioritize anyone. Each of them brings something unique and valuable to the community. You'll probably recognize many of these names, and if not, I really encourage you to check out their channels and show them some love. Even a simple like can be very encouraging, and it is such an easy way to spread kindness. More broadly, I would like to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone who shares their stitching experience, whether on YouTube or anywhere else online. Your work truly inspires others, so please don't stop. It sparked my curiosity again and gave me the courage to return to stitching after taking a long break from this beautiful hobby. This may go without saying, but I still feel it's important to mention. We're all different and we all have our own approaches, not just to stitching, but to many things in life. What I'll be sharing here might not work for everyone, and that's completely okay. We don't have to like the same methods and we can have different opinions. Sometimes we may even disagree, and that's perfectly fine. All I ask is that we remain respectful and kind to one another. No one is being forced to do things a certain way, so if something isn't for you, that's absolutely fine. Just please avoid spreading negativity. In this video, I'll be answering many of the questions I received about my stitching methods. I'll show you how I stitch, explain how the parking method works, and also try to clear up a few common misconceptions about it. There are many different ways to approach full coverage stitching. The teacher in me initially wanted to cover as much as possible, but I decided to keep things focused and simply share what I currently do, my own way of approaching things. Every stitcher develops their own methods, and I think it's wonderful that we can share them and learn from one another. In this video, I'll walk you through two main methods that I use. The first method is very methodical, stitch by stitch, row by row, while the second is more flexible and follows the color more freely within the diagonal. I'm not sure if there are official names for these, so for the purpose of this video, I will call them row by row diagonal method and cross-country diagonal method. Both methods use diagonal stitching and the parking method, but they differ in how you move through your work. One is completely sequential and structured, while the other allows for a bit more freedom within the diagonal. If I were to visualize these two approaches, it would look something like this. Just by looking at this illustration, we can already see the core contrast between these two methods, as well as what they have in common. In both approaches, I work in diagonals that span across 3 10x10 blocks, and I use the parking method in each of them. But there are also three key differences. The first method is more sequential and methodical. I follow a very organized, structured way of placing each stitch. The second method is a bit more flexible with cross-country stitching, but still within the boundaries of the diagonal, so it keeps a sense of structure. The first method is row-driven, meaning I work stitch by stitch, row by row, from top to bottom. The second method is color-driven. I follow one color at a time until I either run out of thread or complete the diagonal. The first method follows a very specific order and feels more controlled and methodical, while the second allows for more flow and flexibility, still within the framework of the diagonal. Before I demonstrate how these two methods work, let's take a moment to look at some of their pros and cons. This might help you decide which one you would like to try. Let's start with the row-by-row diagonal method. Here are the advantages. First and foremost, and this is the most important benefit for me personally, I never have to bring my needle up in a hole that already has 2 or more threads in it. I only bring the needle up in an empty hole or one with a single thread. This makes stitching more comfortable and helps the stitches look neater. The second point is an advantage, although for some people it might feel like a drawback. This method is a very structured, logical, and organized, which in my case helps reduce mistakes. It may seem a bit daunting at first, but if you are patient and not in a rush, it can really simplify the process and reduce the number of decisions you have to make. Another benefit is the overall look of the finished stitches. Because each stitch is made in exactly the same way, they tend to lie flat and look more even, which gives a very neat final result. This method also naturally avoids the issue of closed holes, which can sometimes happen in cross-country stitching, especially when it's done in a more random way. Since this problem doesn't occur here, with just one exception, it also contributes to a cleaner, neater look. If you're not familiar with open and closed holes, I will explain that later in the video. Finally, I never have to worry what to do next. I can clearly see where I left off, and when I come back after a break, I can immediately continue. I always know exactly where to start and which color to use. Now let's talk about the potential downsides. First of all, this method really does require patience. There is quite a lot of threading and rethreading involved, so if you don't enjoy threading your needle, or if you prefer a faster, more spontaneous approach, this method might not be the best fit for you. Personally, I am a very patient person and I enjoy methodical step-by-step processes where I always know what to do next. That's why this method works for me. But it's completely understandable if you feel it's not something you would enjoy. There are ways to reduce how often you need to rethread, but it's still a significant part of the process. This was actually my biggest concern at the beginning, but once I found needles that work well for me, threading became much easier and quicker. This method is also a bit slower, mainly because of the rethreading. I personally don't mind that because I'm not in a hurry, and the comfort of stitching this way is very satisfying to me. I really love something that Brenda from the Handwork Maniac channel said in one of her Flosstube videos. I will link that video in the description below. She said that she's a process stitcher, not a project stitcher. I love that. What she meant is that she enjoys the process of stitching itself rather than focusing only on finishing projects quickly, or generally finishing a project. I completely relate to that. Stitching in general isn't a fast hobby, and that's part of what makes it so calming and relaxing. Of course, we all love seeing finished pieces, but it's really the process that brings us joy. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it at all. Just to give you an idea, in a very confetti-heavy area where colors change almost every stitch, with maybe 2 or occasionally 3 stitches of the same color, I usually complete about 100 stitches per hour using this method. And to be honest, these are the main drawbacks I've noticed. I don't really see many other cons to this method. Now let's take a look at the pros and cons of the cross-country diagonal method. This is definitely a faster way of stitching, mainly because there is less threading involved. You work your way through the diagonal using the same color until you run out of thread or complete the section. This really speeds things up and you can see the progress much more quickly. I would also add that this version of cross-country still has a sense of structure. It's not completely random, there is logic to it, and once you understand how it works, it becomes a very enjoyable and efficient way to stitch. As for the drawbacks, the stitches may not look as neat as with the first method, but it's nothing dramatic. If you're working with only a few colors, the result can still be very tidy. However, in confetti-heavy areas, the stitches may appear less even. This is partly because of the threads carried on the back, but also because you sometimes have to bring your needle up through holes that already contain 2 or more threads. This can be a bit tricky, especially if stitches are placed in a less structured order, because you might split existing threads, which can affect the final look. I'll show you later how to minimize this issue. This is more noticeable when stitching with 2 strands and less of a concern when using just one. Another thing to consider is that this method requires you to make more decisions while stitching, especially when it comes to the order of stitches. That said, it's not as complicated as it might sound, and I will show you how to approach this in a simple way. Now let's take a look at some general characteristics as well as the pros and cons of diagonal stitching. You might be wondering why I choose to work in diagonals instead of rows or columns. Of course, you can stitch in any way that works best for you. I also like to stitch using the Royal Rose method, which is really nice and structured as well. There are so many different approaches out there, as you can easily see on YouTube. I personally enjoy working in diagonals because I like how the design develops this way, but also because it helps reduce an issue that can appear when working in straight blocks. You may have heard of terms like block lines, tension lines, or page lines. These are faint lines that can sometimes appear between sections due to the way stitches pull on the fabric. When working in straight blocks, these lines can occasionally become visible. With diagonal stitching, this is less likely to happen because we are not creating long straight edges, we're creating a more stepped edge instead. The only straight edge appears at the bottom of a larger block of diagonals. However, because I use the parking method and park threads below the diagonals as well as to the next diagonal to the right, it helps even out the tension, reducing the chance of visible lines. The parking method in general supports this by distributing tension more evenly across the fabric, especially when threads are carried into neighboring areas. There's also a technique called feathering, which can help minimize these lines even further. Another reason I enjoy diagonal stitching is the sense of variety it brings. I enjoy working diagonals that span across 3 blocks, 3 10x10 blocks, so within one diagonal I often cover different parts of the design and use multiple colors. This keeps the process more interesting and engaging. This also leads to a nice sense of progress and satisfaction. My diagonals consist of 300 stitches, which is about what I complete in one stitching session. So each time I sit down to stitch, I can often finish a full diagonal. This gives me a sense of completion and instant gratification. It's like finishing a small piece of a puzzle. When it comes to the parking method, I've come across quite a few myths, so I hope I can help clear some of them up. It's really not as complicated as it might seem. It's actually a very logical and effective way of working. Let me say this right from the start. With the perking method, you don't have to remember anything, like which thread is which color. That's a very common misconception, and that would be actually a nightmare. One of the most common myths is that the perking method uses more floss than cross-country stitching. I'd like to show you that this isn't really the case, because the difference between cross-country and perking is not in how the stitches are made, but in how the work is managed over time and across the fabric. I think the easiest way to explain this is with an example. First, let's go over the most important rule of the perking method. You always park your thread in the same hole. Let me show you what I mean. To make a cross stitch, we use 4 holes. I always start my stitch in the bottom left hole. Let's call this hole number 1. I make the first leg from the bottom left to the top right, and then the second leg from the bottom right to the top left. So when I'm ready to park my thread for the next stitch, I always bring it up in the bottom left hole of the next stitch. Again, hole number 1. This is crucial because when I come back to that parked thread later, I immediately know what to do with this thread. I don't have to think or check, I just continue the stitch from the same starting point, because I know that parked thread is in the hole number 1. Then I continue stitching with that color following the pattern, and when I need to park the thread again, I do exactly the same thing. I bring it to the bottom left hole of the next stitch, because that's always where my stitches begin. Now that we understand the crucial rule of parking, let's come back to the difference between cross-country stitching and the parking method. Let's imagine we need to stitch this star symbol. We'll use it as a simple example. I'll mark the stitches one by one just as if we were stitching them, and I will also show how the thread travels on the back of the fabric. This way we can see how much thread is used. First, let's look at what a cross-country stitcher might do. Of course, this is just one example, there are many ways to approach this, but this will help me illustrate the idea. So a cross-country stitcher would typically pick one color and complete all the stitches in that color, either until the thread runs out or until all those stitches are finished. And this would be the result. We can see how the thread travels and how much of it is used. Now let's set that aside for a moment and look at how a parking stitcher would approach the same situation. Let's say it's me and I'm working with diagonals. I would start by stitching the first diagonal and then park the thread in the next stitch in the following diagonal, bringing it to the bottom left hole, but not stitching it yet. Then I unthread the needle and move on. I continue working through the first diagonal, stitching other colors and parking each thread into the next diagonal. Once the first diagonal is complete, I move on to the second one, and now I return to the thread I parked earlier. I pick that thread, thread it, and I stitch all the symbols of that color within this diagonal. When I'm done, I park it again in the next stitch I'll be working on, but I don't stitch it yet. I continue the process working through the diagonal, then returning to parked threads, stitching them and parking them again into the next diagonal. Eventually, I come back to that same thread and finish the remaining stitches. Now, if we compare both approaches, can you see the difference in the amount of thread used? Hopefully your answer is no, because there is really no difference. And here we come to a very, very important conclusion. Let's think about it for a moment. In cross-country, your guiding principle is follow the color. You take one thread and you stitch all or most of the color in a given area. You move across the fabric to wherever that color appears next, and you stop when the thread runs out or the color is finished. So in this case, the thread itself defines your workflow, okay? Now in the parking, the guiding principle shifts to follow the area. You work within a defined section. It can be a diagonal, a 10 by 10 block, or any area you choose. You stitch until the color continues outside your current section, and instead of jumping ahead, you park the thread, you leave it ready in the next spot, and then switch to another color within the same area. So here, the area defines your workflow, not the thread. Let that sink in. So we can also simplify it like this. Cross-country is thread-driven workflow. You prioritize the efficiency of a single thread, and your movement across the fabric is more fluid and wide. Parking is area-driven workflow. You prioritize control within a specific section, and threads are paused and resumed to maintain structure. So in a way, parking isn't a different stitching method, it's a different way of organizing your work. Instead of finishing a thread's journey, you pause it and anchor it in place so your stitching area stays controlled and organized. That's why the difference can feel quite significant, even though the stitches themselves are exactly the same. Cross-country focuses more on speed and thread efficiency, while parking focuses more on accuracy and pattern control. So the experience changes even if the stitches and the thread length don't. Now to finish this part, I will also mention a couple of practical things. With the parking method, you will have multiple threads hanging in your work, which some people may not enjoy. If you prefer a very clean workspace without loose threads, this method might not be ideal for you. On the other hand, one big advantage is that mistakes are much easier to spot, because you're working within a smaller controlled area. Parking is also best suited for full coverage pieces. For smaller projects or designs like samplers, it often doesn't make as much sense to use this method. Now let me show you how I move through a design using the row by row diagonal method. I'll start with a quick example just to give you a general idea of how I approach the pattern, and then we'll move on to the actual stitching. I use an app called Markup RXP on my iPad. I'm not going to turn this into a full tutorial on the app, but I'll briefly show you the main settings and features that I use. So first of all, I turn on the diagonal lines, since I'll be working with diagonals. This adds guiding lines across the entire pattern, which makes it much easier to follow my structure. And at the top of the screen, there are three main icons. The icon on the right allows me to move the pattern around and zoom in and out when it's activated. The icon in the middle is the search tool. When it's active, I can select and highlight a specific symbol that I want to stitch. The icon on the left is the markup tool. This allows me to mark stitches that I've already completed, as well as indicate where I've parked threads. If I long press on a symbol, an additional menu appears, and from there I can choose where to park the thread. I always select the bottom left corner because that's where I start each stitch. Now let me give you a quick overview of how I move through the design using this method. With the row by row diagonal method, I start my first stitch in the upper right corner of the diagonal. Then I work across the first row, stitch by stitch, moving from right to left. Once I finish that row, I move down to the next one and repeat the process, again stitching from right to left. I continue like this row by row, working methodically until I reach the bottom left corner of the diagonal. Then I move on to the next diagonal. I start again in the upper right corner, complete the first row, then move down row by row, always staying within the boundaries of the diagonal. For each new row, the first stitch I make is the one that touches or is crossed by the diagonal line. From there, I continue stitching across the row. I keep working this way stitch by stitch, row by row, until I reach the bottom left corner of the diagonal. Then I move to the next diagonal and repeat exactly the same process, starting in the upper right corner and working my way down. If I zoom out, you can see that after completing 3 diagonals, the shape spans across 3 10 by 10 blocks. This is the size of the diagonal that I personally like to work with. So when I move on to the next diagonal, I follow the same method, but I stop once I reach the 3rd block. I continue working with these 3 block diagonals as I move across the design. As I approach the edge of the project, the diagonals will naturally become shorter, but I still stitch them in exactly the same way, starting from the upper right corner and working row by row down to the bottom left. Now let me pause for a moment and explain why I like working with diagonals that span across 3 blocks. There are 2 main reasons. The first one is that each diagonal consists of 300 stitches, which is roughly what I can complete in one stitching session. So in one sitting, I can finish a full diagonal, which feels very satisfying. And to explain the second reason, I will show you my very professionally prepared prop. So let's imagine this is my scroll frame, and I like when my work develops from the upper left corner and progresses from top to bottom. When I finish stitching across 3 10 by 10 blocks, which can take some time, especially in larger projects, I can simply rotate the scroll bars and continue working in exactly the same way on the next section. When I complete one larger section of the design, I just move the scroll bars to reveal a new empty area to stitch. This is also why I limit my diagonals to 3 blocks in height. Some stitchers prefer to work diagonals across the entire project from top to bottom, but that approach doesn't work well for me. I find this method much more manageable. Of course, it doesn't have to be exactly 3 blocks. You can extend your diagonals to 4 blocks, 5, or however many blocks feel comfortable for you. You might also be wondering whether there are visible lines between these larger sections. In my experience, I haven't noticed any, and I believe that's mainly thanks to the parking method. Because threads are parked both horizontally and vertically, the tension is distributed more evenly across the fabric. Once I finish one of these larger sections, I rotate the scroll bars again and start working on the next one. I repeat the same process, stitching diagonally, row by row, and gradually moving through the design. In the app that I use, there is also a nice feature of the preview. You can easily see your progress and where you are in the pattern. And when you select a symbol, the corresponding color appears at the bottom of the screen, which makes it easy to compare with your floss and check that you are using the correct one. You will also see the thread number, of course, the symbol, and additional information, the total number of stitches for that color, as well as how many are still left to stitch. Now that we've gone through the theory, let's put it into practice. I'll just mention that I may repeat a few things along the way, but that's intentional. It's all for educational purposes. I really want you to understand the logic behind the parking method and hopefully clarify some of the ideas as we go. We'll work through the first diagonal slowly and carefully so you can clearly see the process. Later on, I may speed things up a little just to keep the video from getting too long, although it will still be a longer one. For this demonstration, I'll be using my current project from my own pattern. I'm stitching it on 16 count Aida using full crosses with 2 strands. I've just finished another large section of diagonals and now I'm starting a new one. For the purpose of this demonstration, we can treat this as if it were the very beginning of the project, starting in the upper left corner. So just ignore the stitches you see above. I've also been asked how to actually find the upper left corner when starting a full coverage piece. I've prepared a one-page guide for that, so you can find the link to this in the description below. I like to grid my fabric using a water-soluble marker. This is the one that I use. It has a fine tip, so the lines are nice and thin. Once I determine the upper left corner, I begin gridding the fabric. There's no need to grid the whole fabric and everything at once. You can draw a few squares to start and then continue adding new squares as you move through your project. Some stitchers like to mark the centers of their 10 by 10 blocks with a different color using a small cross or a dot, or even full lines, and some also add diagonal guidelines. I don't do that, but it's also a good option. As for the needles, I liked working with DMC needles, but recently I switched to millwork tapestry needles. I feel they have larger eye because threading these needles is much easier for me, and that's especially important when using the parking method. Threading really shouldn't be frustrating. I will place my iPad in the bottom right corner so you can follow exactly what I'm doing on the pattern. So let's begin. I'm looking at the first diagonal, which at the beginning of the work is always a triangle in the corner, and that's what we will stitch first. I start by highlighting the first stitch in the top row on the right side. I'll be working from right to left, and I'll explain why a bit later. The color number is 832, so I take my floss pack, pull out a strand, and I thread my needle. I make the first stitch. Since I have a loop, I start with a loop start. I use a few different methods for starting and ending threads. Nothing unusual, but maybe I can make a separate video about that in the future if you like. After making that first stitch, I go back to my pattern and look for the next symbol within this triangle. I can see the same symbol to the right and below the stitch I just made, but those belong to the next diagonal, so I ignore them for now. I'm only focusing on this small triangle. I scan the pattern row by row from right to left until I find the next stitch of the same color. It's the first stitch on the left side in the third row. I locate the bottom left hole of that stitch, bring my thread up there, and park it. Then I remove the needle from the thread. Next I go back to my pattern, I mark the stitch I've just completed, and then I long press the stitch where I parked the thread. A new window pops up, it asks me where I want to park the thread, and I always select the bottom left corner and park in the bottom left corner because that's the hole where I always start my stitches. And that's my first parked thread. Now I highlight the next symbol in the first row, again working from right to left. I make the second stitch, and now let's see where I'm going to park the thread. I scan the first row, and it turns out the next stitch in this color is actually in the same row. So I locate the bottom left hole of that stitch, I park my thread there, and then I mark both the stitch I've completed and the parked thread in the pattern. Now let me pause here for a second. Since the next stitch of this color is in the same row, I could leave the needle on the thread and set it aside for a moment. I won't stitch it just yet, but because I know I will come back to this color very soon in the same row, I can keep the needle threaded and use a different needle for the next color. I'll show you this approach a bit later. Now I move on to the next stitch, and this is what we often call a ninja stitch, just a single stitch. I double check the surrounding area, and there are no more stitches in this color within this triangle, so I make that stitch and there is nothing to perk. Since I've just threaded a new needle and only used it for this one stitch, I still have plenty of thread left. So I place the needle in my thread organizer, leaving the thread attached. I mark this stitch as completed and move on to the next one. As you can see, I'm working very methodically, stitch by stitch from right to left. Now I come across a color with 5 stitches, so that's a little celebration moment because 5 stitches in one color is quite a lot. I'm very used to confetti heavy areas, and to be very honest, I actually don't enjoy large blocks of a single color. They can feel a bit boring. With frequent color changes there is more variety. I actually like changing the colors, and I think that the confetti heavy areas always look really interesting. So I complete these 5 stitches, and now let's think about where I'm going to park the thread. I'll pause here for a moment and see if you can guess. It's never random, it always follows the same logic. I mark the finished stitches and scan the pattern within this triangle row by row from right to left. The next stitch in this color appears in the second row, and it will be the second stitch in that row. So I bring my thread to the bottom left hole of that stitch, park it there and mark it in the pattern. Now the next symbol. There is only one stitch of this symbol in the first row, so I make that stitch. The next one in this color is actually the first one in the next row, so since it's the first stitch, I go ahead and make it right away. Once I've done that, I look for the next place where I will park the thread. Can you guess where it will be? Let's see. I scan the same row first, it's not there, so I move one row down and working from right to left, I find the first occurrence of this color. And that's where I park my thread. Why didn't I park it directly below the stitch I just made? Because that stitch belongs to the next diagonal. I pretend it doesn't exist. I'm only focusing on the diagonal that I'm currently working on. Now I look back at the pattern and, surprise, I can see a red triangle, which means that there is a parked thread waiting for me. I highlight the symbol and prepare to use the thread. Let me show you how I do it. I place my right hand over the threads to keep them in place, and then with the left hand I use the eye of the needle to pull out the correct thread. Once I have it, I thread my needle and make that stitch. I quickly scan the pattern again and see that the next stitch is directly below, so I park my thread there. And just like that, the first row is complete. Now I move on to the second row. I can see that the first stitch already has a thread parked, so I simply pick it up, thread the needle, and continue. I make 5 stitches with this color. By now you probably already know where I'm going to park the thread. In the row below, in the first stitch on the right side. Just as a reminder, notice that I always park my threads in the bottom left hole for the next stitch, because that's where I begin each stitch. Technically, in this case, I could go ahead and make those stitches in the next row right now, but for the sake of this tutorial, I will leave them for later. Now the next symbol is the question mark, so I highlight it. There is no red triangle here, which means there is no parked thread, and that's correct. So I thread a new color and make the 2 stitches. Then I look for the next occurrence of this symbol. I scan each row from right to left and I find it in the next row, and that's where I park my thread. I mark the stitches I've completed and I also mark where I parked the thread. And then I highlight the next stitch in the row. I already have the thread parked here, so I simply thread it and make that stitch. Now can you guess where I'm going to park the thread? I scan my diagonal row by row from right to left and I find the next stitch in this color, and that's where I'm going to park my thread. Why not here? Because that stitch belongs to the next diagonal. I pretend it doesn't exist. I focus only on the diagonal I am currently working on. The second row is finished, so I move on to the third row. I can see that I already have a thread parked here, so I thread the needle and make the first 3 stitches with this color. I clicked something in the app and the first stitch isn't highlighted, but that's okay, please just ignore it. Notice that when I work this way, I always bring my needle up through an empty hole for the first leg and through a hole with just 1 thread for the second leg. This helps the stitches look very neat because each one is made in a consistent way without crowding the holes. I've made these stitches and I don't see this symbol anywhere else in this diagonal, so I finish the thread using a pin stitch. I mark these stitches as done and highlight the next symbol. I can see that I should have a thread parked here, so I go to my work and yes, the thread is here. I thread the needle and make that stitch. Now here I can see the same symbol in the same row. I just need to skip 1 stitch. In this case I can park the thread there and keep the needle on the thread. I park it and place the needle in the fabric or on a needle minder. Since I'll be using it again in just a moment, I don't unthread it. I mark the pattern as usual, I mark the stitch I made and where I parked the thread. Then I highlight the next symbol. It's the question mark and I already have the thread parked here, so I simply thread the needle and make the stitch. I can see that this color continues in the next row. The first stitches in the next row are made with this color, so I go ahead and make those 2 stitches as well. I don't see the symbol anywhere else nearby, so I finish the thread with a pin stitch. I mark the stitches as done and highlight the next one. And the next one is actually the stitch I put on hold earlier. So I pick up the needle and make those 2 stitches. Now the situation changes. I scan my diagonal row by row, and I don't see the symbol anywhere within this diagonal I'm working on. In this case, I move on to the next diagonal and scan it from top to bottom, again going row by row from right to left until I find the next occurrence of this symbol. And there it is. So that's where I'm going to park my thread. I highlight the next symbol. The thread is already parked here, so I simply pick it up and make that stitch. Have you noticed that I don't have to remember what that thread is? I don't need to memorize anything. I just work methodically stitch by stitch and everything is clearly marked in the app. In fact, when I work with this method, I don't even mark where I park the thread, because I don't really need to. But I don't want to confuse you, so let's continue doing it step by step. So I make that stitch and park the thread in the stitch below because that's the next occurrence of this color within my triangle. I highlight the next symbol. The thread is already parked, so I make 3 stitches. Then I park the thread 2 rows below in the first stitch on the right. Why there? Because all the other highlighted symbols belong to different diagonals. I highlight the next stitch. There is no parked thread here, so I take a new floss with new color, thread the needle, and make the stitch. Then I park the thread in the next row in the first stitch on the left. The last symbol in this row is a nice one because I already have a thread parked here. I make that stitch and then I can also continue and make 5 stitches in the next row with the same color. I usually stitch while carefully following the pattern, and only after I've completed and parked everything do I go back and mark it in the app. This way, once I finish marking, I can immediately highlight the next symbol and continue stitching without interruption. The next symbol already has a thread parked, so I make that stitch and then park the thread below in the first occurrence of this symbol when scanning from right to left. Another row is finished, so I move on to the next one. I highlight the first symbol, make that stitch, and now where do I park it? This symbol doesn't appear anywhere else in this diagonal I'm working on, so I scan the next diagonal from top to bottom, again moving from right to left until I find the next occurrence, and here it is. So I park the thread there. I make the next stitch using the parked thread, and then I park it just below. I highlight the next symbol, I make 3 stitches with the parked thread, and then park it in the row below, right next to the thread I parked just a moment ago. I highlight the first stitch in the next row, make that stitch, and now where do I park it? There are no more stitches with this color in my current diagonal, so I scan the next one and I find it in the first row. I make the 2 stitches, then scan the next diagonal from top to bottom, moving from right to left, and park the thread in the first highlighted stitch on the right. I select the next symbol. I need a new color here, so I first check my leftover thread organizer, and I can see that I already have this color prepared. So I simply pick up the needle with that thread color and make that stitch. Then I park it in the next row. I highlight the next symbol, the star. I make the first stitch and put the needle on hold, because I'll be using it again in just a moment in the same row. I make another stitch and then park the thread in the next diagonal. Where exactly? You already know the process. I scan from top to bottom, from right to left, row by row, until I find the first highlighted stitch, and that's where I park it. Now get ready for a little celebration because we are finishing the first diagonal. I make the last 4 stitches and park the thread in the first row of the next diagonal. Then I mark everything in the up and yay! The whole first diagonal is done. Doesn't it look beautiful? So what do you think? Was it very complicated? I actually find it very logical, methodical, and organized. I don't have to think too much. I simply work through it stitch by stitch. The stitches look really neat and the threads don't bother me at all. But again, I know this method isn't for everyone, and that's completely fine. Now that we've finished this diagonal, we move on to the next one. The second diagonal is slightly larger. It spans across 2 10 by 10 blocks. But the idea and the method don't change. I focus only on this diagonal and I pretend nothing else exists. The only exception is when I need to park a thread and there is no place for it within this diagonal, then I look into the next one. Other than that, I ignore everything else. Let's work through the next diagonal as well, but this time I will speed things up a little and only pause at some more interesting moments. So I highlight the first symbol in the first row on the right side and prepare that color. Let me also mention that when working this way, it really helps to shift your mindset. I focus only on the current diagonal. I look at other diagonals only when I need to park a thread. I think from top to bottom. I analyze the pattern row by row from right to left. I make the first 3 stitches and park the thread below. The next symbol is the black color, so I make 4 stitches and then park the thread in the next row in the first black symbol when scanning from the right. The next symbol is the moon. This is a new color. I can see that there is only 1 stitch of this color within this diagonal I'm working on, so there is no place to park it. However, I can see 1 stitch of this color in the next diagonal, so that's where I park the thread. The next color is already parked, so I make that stitch and then park it in the next row. Notice here that there are 3 stitches of the same color in the next row, and actually the one on the left is closer to the stitch I just made. You might think that it would make sense to park there to save a bit of thread, but that's not how I approach it. I always scan row by row from right to left, and I park in the first occurrence of the symbol from right side. When I finish this diagonal, I will explain why I follow this direction, why I work from right to left when I use this method. Finally, I make the last stitch in this row and park the thread just below it. I begin the next row with the first stitch, and now let's think for a moment about where to park the thread. First, I scan the diagonal I'm currently working on, and I do find the next occurrence of this symbol within it. So I could park my thread there, and that would be perfectly fine. However, I'm in an area where this symbol appears quite frequently. There is a big block of this color. And if I look at the next diagonal, I can see that the first occurrence of this symbol there is actually closer to the stitch I just made. So in this case, I can choose to park the thread in the next diagonal instead. When I later reach the symbol in my current diagonal, I'll simply start a new thread. This is just a small optimization to avoid carrying the thread too far and to save a bit of floss. In the next stitch, I already have a thread parked, so I make these 2 stitches. I can see that the next stitch is the first one in the next row, so I can go ahead and make it immediately. I can make that stitch because it's the first in the row, and because there is already a stitch above it and one diagonally above to the left. And we have a similar situation here. Normally I would park the thread in the next occurrence within the current diagonal, but in this case the same symbol appears closer in the next diagonal, so I will park it there and again start a new thread when I reach the symbol in my current diagonal. The next one is a new color. I make that stitch, and since the color doesn't appear anywhere else in my diagonal, I park it in the next diagonal. Now we have the star symbol. 2 stitches, skip 2 stitches, and then 1 more stitch. So I make the 2 stitches, park the thread in the next stitch, and I could leave the needle on the thread, but this time I decide to unthread it. Now I'll speed up the video a little and pause again when something interesting comes up. Here I'm working on this upside down triangle symbol. I've made 2 stitches, and now the question is, where am I going to park the thread? I look for the next occurrence of this symbol within my diagonal, scanning the rows one by one from right to left. I pretend the other diagonals don't exist. My diagonal starts where the diagonal line is. So I would park in the first occurrence of this symbol in the next row. Why not here? Because that stitch belongs to the next diagonal. Now the next question is, should I park here or can I make these stitches right away? I can always choose to park, but if possible, I can also continue stitching. In this case, I can make these stitches immediately because they are the first stitches in the row and each of them has a stitch directly above and diagonally above to the left. So I make these two stitches and I would normally park in the next occurrence of this symbol, but my thread is too short, so I need to end it. I'll speed up the next stitches. Now here I need to start a new thread, and I found this color in my leftover thread organizer. This thread doesn't have a loop, so I can't use a loop start. I'm not sure if I've shown this method before. I sometimes vary how I start depending on the area. Here I bring the needle through the upper left hole from front to back, leaving a short tail that I will trim in a moment. Then I come up through the center of the stitch from back to front, and then go down through the upper right hole, and this creates something like a half diagonal pin stitch. Then I make the first leg of the stitch as usual. Then I bring the needle up in the bottom right hole, but I pause briefly to trim the tail, and then I complete the stitch. There are 3 stitches of this color in this row, so I could leave the needle on the thread. Sometimes I do, but usually I unthread it anyway because threading is quick and doesn't bother me. I think it just depends on my mood whether I feel patient in that moment or not. Now there won't be anything particularly special for a little while, so I will speed up the video. And now let's think about this symbol. There is one stitch here, and it doesn't appear in the next diagonal, but I can see it in the one after that. So the question is, should I park my thread there? It really depends on how far you are comfortable carrying your thread. If it feels too far for you, then don't park it. Just end the thread. If the distance feels acceptable, then you can go ahead and park it. This is very much a personal decision. You can ask yourself, would I stitch that distance if I were working cross-country? For me, this is a bit too far, so I will end the thread and come back to it later when I reach that area. As a general rule, I am comfortable carrying my thread up to about 10 stitches. Between 10 and 15 stitches, I start to think twice because it becomes quite a long carry. If it's just a single stitch or a small group and the color ends there, I might still carry it. But usually anything above 15 stitches is too far for me. I would actually say I'm quite liberal in this regard. I know some stitchers who carry threads only up to 3 stitches. For me, that would mean finishing and starting threads too often. But of course, that approach results in a cleaner back if that's something you care about. Personally, I don't worry about the back, I don't care how it looks. I focus on how the front looks. Here you can see that I leave the needle on the thread because there are 2 stitches of that color in the same row. In this row, the stitches form like a checkerboard pattern, stitch, skip, stitch, skip. In situations like this, I almost always leave the needle on the thread. Now let's speed things up. There is nothing particularly special happening here, and I hope by now you have a good understanding of the parking method and this row by row approach. As you can see, there is no need to remember anything. We mark everything in the app or on paper if you're using a printed pattern. I'll show you later how to mark a printed chart as well. I also hope that the hanging threads don't seem as confusing anymore. I'm actually curious, do you still feel like it looks messy? As you can see, we are always focusing on just one thread at a time. Even though it might look overwhelming when you see all the threads at once, when you zoom in and work within a small area, it becomes much more manageable and actually quite logical and organized. Listen, can you hear it? It's the sound of celebration. We've just finished another diagonal. Now, if I were to continue with this method, I would simply move to the upper right corner of the next diagonal and work my way down again stitch by stitch, row by row, from right to left. Please let me know what you think about this method and whether the parking method feels at least a little bit clearer now. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be happy to answer them. So these are the threads we have parked in the next diagonal that I will be working on. You might be wondering about all those vertical threads running down. I'll show you exactly when and how they appear later, but for now, just know that these are parked threads from the diagonals above. I really love this approach because it adds another level of organization and neatness. I also keep a piece of fabric at the bottom where I tuck in the ends of the threads. This way they are not hanging around, and at the top I only have the threads that I'm actively working with. Now that you've seen how I stitched the first two diagonals, you might be wondering why I work from right to left and not the other way around. So let me explain that. When we make a stitch, we pass the needle through the fabric 4 times, twice up and twice down. When we go from front to back, it's never really an issue because whatever happens on the back stays on the back. But when we bring the needle from back to front, that's where things can sometimes get tricky. Take a look. As you can see, I already have my threads parked and everything looks fine. But if I start working from the left side, here's the problem. I need to make 2 stitches in this dark blue color. The first one is fine, but when I try to make the second stitch, I run into a parked thread. To make the second leg, I have to bring my needle up through a hole that already has that loose thread in it. When working with 2 strands, this can be quite tricky. That parked thread can take up most of the space in that hole, and if I try to push the needle through, I might split the thread. So I have to move it aside, make some space, and then continue. Even then, the stitches may not look as neat as they could. So the main issue is that you keep running into those loose parked threads, which can make stitching a bit frustrating, at least for me in my experience. And that's why I prefer to work from right to left. When I do that, I'm only bringing my needle up through a hole that is either empty or already has 1 thread in it. But even that thread is part of a completed stitch, not a loose one. Because of the tension, that thread actually helps keep the hole open, making it much easier to pass the needle through. This results in more even stitches because each one is made in a consistent way. Let's look at it again. I either bring the needle up through an empty hole to make the first leg, or through a hole with 1 thread to make the second leg. Only in the very last stitch in the row, the one on the far left, do I pass through holes in thread in them. But even then, those are not loose threads, they are part of finished stitches, so they don't cause the same issue. Alright, now that we've learned about the first method, let's move on to the second one, which something tells me you will really enjoy, especially if you're used to cross-country stitching. The second method of working with diagonals that I use is definitely faster and involves less threading. But the downside for some people may be that the stitches are not as neat as with the first method, especially in confetti-heavy areas. It can also be a bit frustrating at times because here we often work with closed holes, so the needle doesn't always go through an empty space. Instead, it may pass through holes that already contain 1, 2, or even 3 threads, and sometimes even a bulk of threads on the back. Let me first show you in theory how this method works, and then we'll move on to a real stitching example. In this method, I start by highlighting the first symbol in the upper right corner of the diagonal, and then I make all the stitches of that color within this diagonal. So this is essentially cross-country stitching, but limited to the diagonal I'm currently working on. Once I finish all the stitches of that color, and if I still have thread left, I park it in the first occurrence of that symbol in the next diagonal. Then I highlight the next symbol and make all the stitches of that color within the same diagonal. I continue until I either run out of thread or finish all stitches for that color. When I'm done, I park the thread in the next diagonal. I then highlight the next symbol. As you can see, I'm not choosing symbols randomly. I move again, row by row from right to left when I'm picking the symbol, and I always pick the next available symbol to stitch. This reduces the number of decisions I have to make. I don't have to think about which color to choose or where to start. I simply follow the pattern in a structured way. I make the stitches, and if I still have thread left, I park it in the next diagonal. I think I can already hear some of you saying, "Wow, I love this method, I have to try it." Am I right? Now take a look what happens when we move on to the next diagonal. Imagine that there are threads hanging from each red triangle here. First, we want to take care of these parked threads. So if there are any parked threads in the diagonal, I start by working through them from the bottom. You'll see later why this is important. I highlight the first parked thread starting from the bottom, then make all the stitches with this thread within this diagonal, and finally park it in the next diagonal. In the first occurrence of that symbol when scanning from top to bottom, just as we've been doing all the time. Next, I highlight the next parked thread from the bottom. I'm looking from the bottom to top, from right to left. I make all the stitches of that symbol within the diagonal and then park it in the next diagonal. In the first occurrence of that symbol, looking from top to bottom, from right to left. I move on to the next parked thread, again starting from the bottom. I make all the stitches for that symbol within this diagonal and park it in the next one. I repeat this process for every parked thread, and once I'm done, all the parked threads from this diagonal have been moved forward into the next one. At this point, I can continue working through the diagonal as usual. I select the first available symbol, stitching all the stitches of that color, and park the thread in the next diagonal. Then I highlight the next symbol, make all the stitches within this diagonal, and park the thread in the next one. I repeat the process for all remaining symbols in this diagonal. Eventually, the entire diagonal is stitched and all threads are parked in the next diagonal. Then I move on to the next diagonal, and again I start by clearing all the parked threads. I work from bottom to top, selecting the first parked thread at the bottom, stitching all its occurrences, and parking it in the next diagonal. And I repeat the process. So that's the theory, and now let's put it into practice. So in order to show you this method from the beginning, I first need to clean up this area. I'll finish off all the threads, and now we have a clean space where I can demonstrate the method properly. Of course, we're not starting from the very corner, but the process works exactly the same for every diagonal, no matter where you begin. I start by selecting the first symbol in the upper right corner of the diagonal I'm working on and highlighting all instances of that symbol within the pattern. I pretend the other diagonals don't exist. I focus only on the one I'm currently working on, and I begin stitching all occurrences of this symbol within that diagonal. I say all, but in practice it depends on the length of my thread. I stitch as long as the thread allows me. In this case, my thread is too short to complete all the stitches, so I end it. At this point, I can either continue with the same color using a new thread or move on to the next symbol. This time I decide to move on. I select the next symbol in the first row, again thinking row by row from top to bottom, from right to left. I thread my needle and stitch all occurrences of that color within the diagonal. Notice that with this method I sometimes allow myself to carry the thread a bit further, but I do so carefully. Carrying threads too far can lead to build up on the back, which may affect how the stitches lie in front. So here I need to make a decision. I check whether the symbol appears again within my current diagonal. It doesn't, so I look for it in the next diagonal. It appears quite high up. I did carry my thread a similar distance earlier, but if I do that again, I will create another long carry on the back. So in this case, I decide to finish this thread and save it for later when I reach that symbol in the next diagonal. I highlight the next symbol in my diagonal. There are only 2 stitches of this color here, and I can see that this color doesn't appear in the next diagonal, but it does show up in the one after that. So now, again, I need to decide whether that distance is acceptable. It's somewhere between 10 and 15 stitches away, so reluctantly, but I decide to park my thread there. I highlight the next symbol and I can see a large block of color. While I work on it, I would like to explain something. As you'll notice, even in this method, I still tend to work row by row from top to bottom. However, since there are no parked threads here and the area is clean, I can stitch either from right to left or from left to right. So when I have a larger area of the same color, I often work in a zigzag pattern, sometimes called the snake method, going left to right, then right to left, while still staying within the boundaries of the diagonal. I didn't complete all the stitches because I ran out of thread, so I finished it and marked the stitches I completed. I highlight the next symbol. There is only one stitch of this color in my diagonal. The next occurrence of this symbol in the following diagonal is a bit too far for my liking, and I don't want to carry another long thread, so I finish this one and plan to use it later when I reach that area. I select the next symbol, and here I can see a clear checkerboard pattern. I work my way down methodically row by row, either from left to right or right to left. Working like this helps maintain the idea of open holes, which keeps the stitches looking neat and even. This concept of open and closed holes is quite important if you're aiming for very tidy stitches. I will explain it in more detail later. I ran out of thread, so I finish it with a pin stitch, but I feel like completing this color, so I quickly rethread my needle with the same color and continue stitching. I make the last stitch and I need to finish this thread because it's too short to park it anywhere. So far this area looks quite clean, right? There's only one parked thread and it's not even in the next diagonal. Next is the moon symbol. There is one stitch in the upper part and more in the lower part. It's quite a distance, but this time I decide to carry the thread and continue working with this color because I know I can complete all the stitches of this color within this diagonal. Once I'm done, I park the thread in the next diagonal. I move on to the next symbol. Nothing special here, I make all the stitches with this color and finish the thread because it's too short to continue. The next color also has just 2 stitches in the upper part and the rest are further below. That's quite a long distance, so again, a bit reluctantly, I decide to carry the thread because I know it's long enough to complete all the stitches of this color within my diagonal. And now we've come to something new. Take a look. I finished all the stitches of this color in my diagonal and I still have thread left to park. I scan the next diagonal from top to bottom and the first occurrence of this symbol is again quite far away. However, I can see that the same color appears closer just below my last stitch. And this stitch actually belongs to the very first diagonal in the next large section below. My diagonals span across 3 10 by 10 blocks and I move from left to right. So this is the area I won't reach until I finish the current section, which might take a few weeks. But still, this is a good place to park the thread. So this is the moment where I create my first thread icicle, as I like to call them. So I park the thread in that stitch, but I don't leave it hanging loosely. I choose a line that will define the length of my icicle, bring the thread straight vertically to that hole, and then back up again 5 stitches lower. Then I tuck the thread under a piece of fabric at the bottom and leave it there until I come back to this area later. Now you can see why there are so many of these thread icicles. They are simply parked threads from previous diagonals, organized neatly so they don't get in the way. I mark the parked thread in my pattern and continue working on this current diagonal. At this point, things can become a bit more challenging because now we have more closed holes and more closed stitches. That means that I often have to bring the needle up through holes that already contain multiple threads, and there are also carried threads on the back. In this particular area, it's not that bad because there aren't that many colors, but in very confetti-heavy sections, it can definitely become tricky. And the closed stitch is actually the one that you are going to make, but it is surrounded by already finished stitches. So now I'll speed things up. I think you already understand the idea. I'll continue working through this diagonal and parking threads into the next one, and then I will show you what happens next. So I've finished this diagonal, and now you can clearly see that nice clean diagonal edge. You can also see that I've reached the span of 3 10x10 blocks, so the next diagonals won't be any longer than this one. We started this diagonal from a completely clean area with no parked threads, but from now on, as we move on to the next diagonals, we will have parked threads hanging down, waiting there. Now imagine starting from the top and working your way down as usual. At some point, you would have to stitch in between all those hanging threads, and that would quickly become very frustrating. So that's why, instead, when we move on to the new diagonal, the first step is to take care of all those parked threads. And here is what to do. Take all those parked threads from the next diagonal and lay them upward on the fabric. Now I work through these threads from bottom to top. I find the first parked thread in this diagonal by looking from bottom to top, from right to left, and highlight that symbol. As you can see, this symbol appears only below Because when we park a thread, we always place it in the first occurrence from the top. So now after highlighting it, I pick up that thread and make all the stitches of this color within my diagonal. This area is clean, there are no hanging threads, I don't have to worry about them, so I'm relaxing stitching my first color. I don't have to work in between any threads because all the parked threads are waiting above. I have a nice clean space to work in. I make all the stitches of this color within my diagonal, and I can see that this symbol doesn't appear in the next diagonal to the right, which I'll be working on next. However, it does appear in the first row of the diagonal below. So that's where I'm going to park my thread. And since that diagonal belongs to the next large section that I will likely work on in a few weeks, I create a thread icicle to secure it and tuck it under the fabric. I mark the stitches I've completed, mark where I parked the thread, and then select the next parked thread, again working from bottom to top and from right to left. This time it's the triangle symbol. I make the 2 stitches of this color and then park the thread in the first occurrence of that symbol in the next diagonal, scanning from top to bottom. Have you noticed the rule here? When I park a thread, I scan from top to bottom, but when I work on the parked threads, I work from bottom to top. I highlight the next parked thread, again from bottom to top, and repeat the same process. I continue like this until I've worked through all the parked threads. And this is the final stitch from the last parked thread in this diagonal. I make the stitch and park the thread in the next diagonal in the first occurrence of this symbol when scanning from top to bottom, from right to left. Now all the parked threads are gone and I have a clean diagonal again. At this point, I can work through it normally, from top to bottom, from right to left. I continue working through the colors, selecting symbols one by one, moving row by row from right to left. Using the cross-country workflow, I make all the stitches of each color within the boundaries of my diagonal. Once I finish a color, I park the thread in the first occurrence of that symbol in the next diagonal, scanning from top to bottom, from right to left. This method is definitely faster than the first one, if you're okay with the fact that not every stitch will be made in exactly the same way and that there may be some thread buildup on the back, as well as closed holes with multiple threads, then I think it's a great, efficient, and well-organized approach. I won't be stitching another diagonal here, but let's talk a bit more about it and I will show you a few additional things. So at this point, I would move on to the next diagonal that spans across 3 10 by 10 blocks. And because there are parked threads, I would first lay them upward and work through them from bottom to top. And after clearing that area, I would continue working on that diagonal from top to bottom, parking threads either in the next diagonal on the right, or if it's closer, in the diagonal below. If I park below, I create a thread icicle and tag the thread under the fabric. Here I'm using a tool that is called an embossing tool, which you may also know as a nail art tool. I actually use it in my watercolor painting to apply masking fluid, but I found it very helpful for cross stitching as well. These tools come in different sizes and have a small round tip, so they are not sharp. There's actually a little ball at the tip, and that's why I like using it. I can move threads or touch the fabric without worrying about damaging anything. I like to use it to pull out my thread icicles and also to separate threads when needed. One more thing I like to do is to slightly moisten my threads before working with them, especially when I pull out my thread icicles. Some threads can be more tangled and this helps straighten them, making stitching more comfortable. I keep a small piece of sponge in a container and I spray it with clean water. Then I take each thread and just run my sponge over it. This helps the threads relax and straighten out. I let them dry completely before stitching. It's very important. Don't stitch with damp threads. It takes just a few minutes. So I usually do this after finishing a diagonal. That way, the next time I sit down to stitch, my threads are smooth and ready to use. After moistening them, I also like to trim the ends slightly, just to make them even, which makes threading the needle easier. Finally, let's take a look at the back, because I know it's almost a taboo topic, and there are usually two groups, those who care about the back and those who don't. Personally, I don't care, I don't worry about it. This is a full coverage piece, it will be framed, no one will see the back, so I really don't mind how it looks. But of course, I'm happy to show it to you to satisfy your curiosity. The small triangle here is where I used the row by row method, the first one, and you can see that it looks quite clean. Even when threads are carried, they tend to be hidden under that dense structured stitching. In the longer diagonals, I used the second method, the cross-country diagonal method, and here you can see the carried threads more clearly. That's especially visible where there is a strong contrast between colors, like this ochre and navy blue. Here's the entire back of my work. In the upper section, you can see the diagonal structure, and in the lower part, where you see those vertical lines, I used the Royal Rose method, which is also my favorite approach when working in straight 10 by 10 blocks. It also involves parking. And here's a quick look at the front. I keep all threads that I'm not currently using tucked under a piece of fabric. I only pull out the threads I need for the diagonal I'm working on, so the active ones stay on top and everything remains organized. If for any reason you prefer working with a printed pattern, here's how I would approach it. First of all, I would draw diagonal guidelines. You could draw them across the entire pattern, but I would only draw them in the area I'm currently working on, so just for the diagonals that span across 3 10 by 10 blocks. I would use two different highlighters, one lighter color and one darker. If I were working with the row by row method, I would highlight the first stitch, make it, and then use the darker highlighter to mark it as a completed. I would also place a small dot in the next stitch to indicate where I parked the thread. Then I would highlight the next symbol, stitch it, mark it as done with the darker highlighter, and again place a dot where I parked the thread. I would continue this process step by step. That would be the ideal workflow for me. However, in practice, when I use this method, I usually don't mark where I park the threads. Since I work very methodically stitch by stitch, I don't actually need to track parked threads. When I reach a stitch and see a thread there, I simply continue stitching. If I were working with a cross-country diagonal method, I would follow a similar approach, but there is one important difference to consider. Let's look at the ideal situation first. I highlight the first symbol, and because I'm working cross-country, I highlight all instances of that symbol within the diagonal. Then I stitch them and mark them all as completed with the darker highlighter. I also place a dot to show where I parked the thread. I would continue like this, but here's what happens when there are many stitches of the same color. I highlight all of them within the diagonal and start stitching. At some point, my thread runs out, so I don't complete all of them. I mark the ones I finished, but now there are still highlighted stitches left. On a digital pattern, that wouldn't be an issue. You could simply remove the highlight, but on paper you can't erase it. So now we have two options. The first option, which probably is the best, is to continue with the same color and finish all the highlighted stitches. The second option is where you don't want to continue this color and you want to start a new one. In this case, you need to use a different highlighter. For example, if you originally used yellow, you might switch to green now for the next symbol. You would mark them in green, you would stitch those and continue like that. Eventually, you would need to go back and finish the remaining yellow stitches. So that's how I would approach working with printed patterns. If you've ever looked for ways to make your stitches neater, you may have come across the idea of open and closed holes. You might also know it under a different name. This concept is often discussed in relation to cross-country stitching, but it also connects to parking in some ways. Let me try to explain what it's all about. I've prepared a few illustrations to help visualize this concept. In this example, I've made the holes much larger so it's easier to see what's happening. I start my stitch in hole number 1 and make the first leg from bottom left to top right. Then I make the second leg from bottom right to top left. After completing this stitch, you can see that there is plenty of space in the holes. This represents an ideal stitch where the thread pulls the fabric slightly toward the center, keeping the holes open. This makes it easier to add surrounding stitches later. To keep stitches neat, it's best to work in a way that keeps these holes open, just like in this example. Now let's take a look at what happens when we choose the next stitch more randomly, as is often the case in cross-country stitching. I've chosen 4 directions as examples to give you a general idea. Let's say I make a stitch and the next one I want to make is above and to the left. I'll try to show the path of the thread both on top of the fabric and underneath. I make the first leg as usual and then complete the second leg. After that, I carry the thread from the top left hole to the next stitch and make that stitch. Now, can you see the issue? The problem is with the top left hole of the first stitch. If we imagine removing the thread that runs underneath, it becomes clearer. That hole is now more closed than the others. It's partially covered by the carried thread. This creates two main problems. That hole is now partially blocked, so when you later bring your needle through it, there is a higher chance of splitting the thread, which can make the stitches look less neat. And the second problem is that the original stitch itself doesn't look as neat anymore. The first leg looks fine, but the second leg becomes slightly distorted or stretched. It's elongated. So how can we fix this? In this case, we can reverse the direction of the second leg. Instead of going from bottom right to top left, we can make the second leg from top left to bottom right. The stitch will still lie in the same direction visually, but now we finish the second leg in the bottom right hole. Then when we carry the thread to the next stitch, we keep all the holes more open. Now let's analyze what happens when the next stitch is above and to the right. I make the first stitch as usual and then I carry the thread to the bottom left hole of the next stitch and I make that stitch. Where is the issue here? The problem appears in the bottom left hole of the next stitch. If we imagine removing the thread that runs under the fabric, we can see more clearly that this thread partially closes that hole compared to the others. This makes the first leg in this stitch a bit elongated and it also reduces the openness of that hole. So how can we fix this? Well, I make the first stitch as usual, but this time instead of going to the bottom left hole of the next stitch, I bring my thread to the upper right hole. From there, I make the first leg from top right to bottom left, and then the second leg as usual from bottom right to top left. The final appearance of this stitch stays the same, but the starting point changes. This adjustment allows the thread to pull the fabric toward the center of the stitch, keeping all 4 holes more open. Now let's see what happens when the next stitch is placed below the first stitch and to the left. I make the first stitch as usual and carry the thread to the bottom left hole of the next stitch. I make this stitch, and is there a problem? Not really. Let me show you why. If we imagine removing the thread that runs under the fabric, you can see that in the top right corner, the thread actually stays underneath the fabric. It doesn't pass through that hole. I'll visualize it with some transparency. The thread travels under the fabric and only comes up in the bottom left hole. Because of this, it doesn't block the upper right hole. And when I make a stitch, all 4 holes remain open. A very similar situation occurs when the next stitch is placed below and to the right. In that case, the thread interacts with the bottom right hole of the first stitch. But again, it doesn't create the same problem, so this direction is also safe. So to sum up, when working cross-country in a more random order and aiming for neat stitches, it's important to remember that when moving upward, you may need to reverse the direction of certain legs to keep the holes open. When moving downward, you generally don't need to worry about this because the holes tend to stay open naturally. This is one of the reasons why I like to work from top to bottom, row by row. It allows me to avoid thinking about this too much. Even when I use a cross-country approach within a diagonal, I'm still moving downward, which naturally supports more open holes. Of course, there are always exceptions. Sometimes it makes more sense to complete a group of stitches in one area before moving on, and in those situations I keep this concept of open and closed holes in mind. Now let me show you this on a real stitch. I make the first leg of the stitch as usual. When I pull the thread, you can hopefully see how it pulls the fabric and opens up the first hole. Then I bring the needle up through the bottom right hole to make the second leg, and I pull the thread. You can see how both of the previous holes open up. Now I finish the second leg, and when I pull the thread, all 4 holes are nicely open. There's plenty of space for threads from surrounding stitches. From here, when I make a stitch anywhere below that first stitch, all the holes will remain open in both stitches. Now I'll make the same stitch again, but this time I want the next stitch to be above and to the left. I complete the second leg and then move to the first hole of the next stitch. When I pull the thread, you can hopefully see that it starts to cover the upper left hole of the first stitch. It also causes the second leg of that stitch to become slightly elongated. If the next stitch is above and to the right, the first stitch looks fine, but now the closed hole appears in the bottom left hole of the next stitch, and the first leg of that stitch becomes elongated. Now let's make these stitches in a better way. I make the first leg of the first stitch, and I already know that the next stitch will be above and to the left. So instead of starting the second leg in the bottom right hole as usual, I start it in the top left hole. I finish this stitch and carry the thread to the next one. When I pull the thread, you can see that all 4 holes in the first stitch remain open. Now what about the case where the next stitch is above and to the right? Let's see. I make the first stitch as usual, but this time instead of starting the next stitch in the bottom left hole, I start it in the top right hole. I go from top right to bottom left and then complete the stitch. Again, this helps keep the holes more open. Finally, there is one more important thing I should mention. When we use the parking method, we always park the thread in the same hole. In my case, the bottom left hole. Let's imagine that these 2 blue stitches and the turquoise thread are part of the same thread. After making these stitches, I park the thread below the last stitch. When I come back to it later, everything works nicely. The holes remain open and stitching is easy. However, let's say that the last stitch in the diagonal is this green one, and the next stitch with that color is above in the next diagonal, which happens quite often. In this case, I have to accept the fact that the bottom left hole of this future stitch will be closed, and the first leg may become slightly elongated. I can't park the thread in a different hole, like the top right corner, because I always park in the bottom left hole. This is really important. Rule number 1 in parking. You always park in the same hole, and that hole is the hole where you start your stitch. I know there is a way to avoid this problem, and I know that there are stitchers who avoid this by only parking in the same row or below, and if the next stitch is above, they simply start a new thread there. But personally, I don't know. I don't do this. I just prefer to accept these small imperfections. And honestly, once the whole piece is finished, this is not noticeable. I'm not entering any competitions, so it doesn't have to be perfect. So these are the methods I currently use in my stitching. Of course, this doesn't mean that they won't evolve over time. I'm always experimenting, adjusting things, and finding what works best for me. For now, I plan to continue stitching my own designs, but I'm also planning to start something much bigger. I'm planning to get a large scroll frame around 1 meter or 40 inches wide. and begin a long-time project that I can keep in the background. I already have a particular scroll frame in mind, but I haven't made a final decision yet. If you have any suggestions for a bigger project, feel free to share them. I'd love to hear your ideas. I really hope that this video helped you understand my approach, my method of working a little better, and maybe it gave you some ideas to try in your own stitching. I also hope that this whole parking method is now a bit clearer to you, but of course, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them and help you if I can. So thank you so much for watching and happy stitching!